Bleach Revisited. I am Karkur Gold, your host of this series in which we will be reading every single chapter of the Bleach manga, providing critical analysis of the art and the narrative, as well as personal response to each of these chapters. We'll also be discussing how the chapter connects to the rest of the manga as a whole. As usual, we begin these videos with a reading of the chapter that we are currently discussing for the episode. This is Chapter 112, The Undead 2, Rise and Rage. Is he gone? That's what you wanted, right? Yes. Forgive me for troubling you. That's okay. He's king of this world. We need him to win. I'll help out any way I can. So, I'm done here. Guess I'll go home. He's strong. Zangetsu. Raise him well, 'cause his power will eventually be mine. Ichigo, I hate rain. It rains in this world too. When you're upset, the skies grow cloudy. When you're sad, it rains. I can't stand it. I wonder if you can grasp the terror of being rained on in this lonely world. To be able to hold back the rain, I'll give you everything I have. Should you place your trust in me, I won't let any rain fall on this world. Believe me, you aren't fighting alone. Ichigo! What the? His Hakudo is practically gone, but now it's blazing! A Hakudo is a being spiritual movement. And this spiritual pressure. Bleach, Chapter 112, The Undead 2, Rise and Rage. The bleeding. It's stopping. Am I being overpowered? Sorry, but I don't have much time. I've got to finish this quick. Finish it quick? That won't do. This is just getting good. Let's make it last. Go as long as we can. What? Ha ha ha! I love how you revive yourself. How you suddenly got stronger. There's so much I want to know, but none of that matters now. For now, let's just enjoy the fight. Jeez, I'm kicking his butt. I'm cutting him, inflicting a lot more damage. It's all going my way. But I cut him, and he won't go down. What's wrong with you? You're crazy. Do you like fighting that much? Aren't you afraid of getting cut? Of getting killed? What's wrong with me? There's something wrong with you. How can you be so strong and not love fighting? Revel in it. The death and the pain, those are the rewards of battle. Do you feel something? Who are you? Are you Yumachika? What's with your hair? Were you an explosion? Did the fireworks get you, huh? Stop laughing. Fine, I'll put this on. No. I was just thinking how the captain's really enjoying himself. Yeah, but isn't his opponent incredibly strong? It's Ichigo. That Ryoka dog. He's like a different person from when we fought. Is the captain under pressure? Yes. That's bad. What if he gets... You idiot. You think he could lose? The great Kenpachi Zaraki of the 11th Company. We joined his company because we believed in him. You can't lose. And anyway, he still has that. This is superb. We're so evenly matched. No, it's close, but you're definitely stronger than I am. What the? Why is he so confident? How long has it been since I felt such joy? Against you, I can finally fight all out. Today, Manorama and Ayasagawa of the 11th Company ignored my instructions to rest and chatted it up on the veranda. I just wish I could tell them to leave if they aren't planning on getting any better. Yumachika's lower than me in rank, but he bosses me around, saying things like, "Hey, can you pass me the nail clippers? That jerk!" They would get better soon. That is it for Bleach 112. What is this? Is this the Undead 2? Is this the Undead 2? No, this is Black and White 2, isn't it? Rise and Rage? Something like that. Let me get back to the beginning of it. I think it's oh boy, I just clicked past it. It's the Undead 2. It's not Black and White 2. That's what I thought it was Undead 2, because Ichigo literally rises from the dead, right? He resurrects, as Kenpachi says. Let's talk about this chapter. Let's talk about what's going on in it. There's a couple significant things that I think are worth pointing out. So, first and foremost is, we get this little conversation between White and Zangetsu, and White's got the Asaichi, Asoichi. Boy, I can't words. He's got the blank Zanpakuto that he was using that was, interplaced. I wouldn't really read this as, I don't know. There's ways to read this, but I wouldn't really read this as being Ichigo's blade if it was completely sealed, because again, the Asaichi is supposed to be the completely blank blade, right? Nevertheless, I think it's it's important that it's there, just to represent who really holds the power here, and ultimately it's Ichigo that's wielding Zangetsu and not what is essentially a blade that is blank, right? He's actually fighting alongside Zangetsu. But yeah, I like that we have this conversation that kind of establishes that White and Zangetsu are in cahoots. That, Zangetsu, old man Zangetsu here was like, yeah, sorry for troubling you. And it's interesting here. I like that White just kind of throws the little blade over his shoulder. Very Ichigo 5 ambulances, Yet again, another kind of nice reflection of Ichigo in a way. But White basically expresses that Ichigo is the king of this world and they need him to win. So even if they are antagonistic against him in this moment, it's all lesson, it's all preparatory, it's always getting Ichigo to win because, he's their king. If they defeat him here, what's the point? They have to test him, yes, but ultimately he needs to win, so they have to find a way to cultivate that one way or another, even if they are presenting themselves not 100% in cahoots to Ichigo, I guess. The idea being that, interestingly enough, the internal parts of Ichigo's soul, these exterior, I say internal, they're still exterior to him, because this is still this manifested force outside of Ichigo. Zangetsu is as much a reflection of a part of Ichigo as it is this externalization, right? Because that's kind of how Shinigami powers work, is that you externalize your Reiatsu into this blade, and then it it is able to release, right? You're able to perform Shikai. And ultimately, that's kind of how all Shinigami abilities work, is that you take your own soul's Rietsu, you externalize it, and then you use words to kind of give it form. So, all the magic that we have, all the Keto and all of that, is essentially the same thing that they're doing with their swords. I say essentially, there's more nuance there, obviously. Like, the sword is something that you cultivated over time. It has a more permanent shape whenever you release it. But magic works the same sort of way. You're externalizing your Rietsu and then you're giving it form. And the words are very much tied to that, like the chants that you use, etc., etc. So it's kind of neat that the sword is like a very personalized form, but these are externalizations of parts of Ichigo's soul, is the way to read this, or at least the way that I read this. If you have a different reading for like kind of these characters and everything, and obviously this will be informed by eventual later chapters, so it does very easily step into spoiler territory. But just for everything up to this point, I think we're meant to read it this way, right? At the very least, we're going to read like, okay, this is Zangetsu personified. Zangetsu is Ichigo's sword. It's unique to him. White is some aspect thereof, maybe tied to hollow abilities. Like I said, that was popular speculation at the time. Certainly tied to some sort of reversal of Ichigo. But it's interesting here that we actually get this moment, and I think this is really telling, is that the black of White's like feature starts to shift and pull into Zangetsu as Zangetsu absorbs White. And White's like, oh, he's strong, Zangetsu, raise him well because his power will be mine. So it's like there's these two aspects of Zangetsu. There's the black and the white, which is kind of interesting. And it's certainly something that you might see even reflected in Zangetsu's design, although not immediately apparent, is that Zangetsu has this very big black blade, but also the white cloth to it. And certainly White is able to manipulate the cloth around very easily. So if he represents the white side of Zangetsu and black and white, that might be kind of what's going on there. But I think it's really cool here that we do see Zangetsu absorb White. They're essentially like, I don't know, like parts of the same power. That said, it's all part of, I guess, Ichigo's inner world, his soul, whatever. But ultimately, it seems like Zangetsu is kind of the one in charge here. Now, as far as like that power will eventually be mine, what White's saying, that seems foreboding. And like whatever that means, like if that means that White will play a bigger role later, if that means White seeks to kind of take over things. Certainly, again, with the speculation that White might be some sort of hollow force, the idea that like eventually Ichigo will give himself over, will be controlled by that hollow force if he were to actually die. Because, again, hollowification, the idea is that you don't have that control over yourself, and perhaps White represents that in some facet. Not quite sure. Nevertheless, I think there's this kind of internal power struggle, this idea that White is perhaps some kind of, I don't know if I would say evil. Evil seems not appropriate, but some sort of reflection of Ichigo that could manipulate that power, right? Ichigo's power, his power, which is weird. It's a weird thing to say, but nevertheless sets up this internal kind of person as White is some sort of antagonistic force, that he wants to claim Ichigo's power, and he wants Zangetsu to kind of cultivate that power as best as possible. And that then does throw a wrench into what we were talking about. Like, if this is really just an aspect of Zangetsu, then is this like other consciousness? How divorced is that from Zangetsu? We start to like have a lot of questions like raised by that. And so I think it's interesting. I think that we get like a really neat kind of moment. And I love that, his eyes are very distinct, very wide here as Zangetsu closes his own. I do like that close up. I also really just the image of White being like kind of shredded and torn away and pulled into old man Zangetsu as White has these kind of parting words is cool. we get this final like moment that reflects on the rain, and again, the rain being kind of tied to trauma, the rain being tied to the death of Ichigo's mother, but also just trauma in Ichigo's life in general and trauma in general. We talked about how the rain happens at several different moments in Ichigo's life, like when the battle with Grand Fisher, whenever he loses his mother, whenever Rukia is taken away, it rains. And ultimately, like, Rukia is the one who kind of drives away the rain for Ichigo by giving him the Shinigami power, by introducing him to this world, right? And so it's neat that Zangetsu has this same sort of reflection of like, look, I hate the rain, like, it's unbearable. Whenever you're upset, like whenever Ichigo is experiencing that sort of trauma, that sadness, his inner world rains, right? And so, like, Zangetsu has no way to kind of flee it, which is interesting. And so the idea is that Zangetsu wants to give Ichigo the power. I say Zangetsu, old man Zangetsu here. And here we can even see the kind of white aspects of this design of the collar here, which they're there earlier, but if you're willing to read like the white and black, the black kind of being the dominant aspect of Zangetsu right now, that's one way to certainly read it. Nevertheless, I do like this final panel here, this idea that old man Zangetsu's like, I'm going to place, if you place your trust in me, I'll give you the power so that rain won't fall into this world anymore, so you won't have to be sad, so that you'll be able to hold back the rain, right? And again, if the rain is ostensibly tied to Ichigo being unable to protect other people, that's the idea, that's the whole deal here. That's like why Ichigo, chases power. What power means to Ichigo is the ability to not lose the people that he loves. Yeah. And of course, we get this kind of touching moment where he expresses, like, look, you're not fighting alone, which is something that Ichigo kind of has been doing so much in his life, or he's been in the mindset of, like, he is this kind of person who has to be this lone fighter. Whenever, time and time again, we're shown that's not the case, right? So, of course, Ichigo now fighting with Zangetsu side by side, actually calling forth his spiritual pressure, using it. He does have this really cool moment where he stands up and Zaraki is shocked by that, and I do love that. We even get to see little Yuichiro there being like, oh. Here Ichigo finally comes to full stand, and we get our, Undead 2, Rise and Rage, which speaks towards, this kind of revival of Ichigo, like I said. He literally rises. I don't know that he rages so much. Maybe that refers a little bit more to Zaraki, but we'll get there. And interestingly enough, his bleeding actually is stopping as well. We talked about this before, and you could arguably see this in this case, where like the wounds on one's spiritual body are reflective of like their actual spiritual wounds, and so Ichigo has had such a dramatic recovery that like even his wounds, which are as physical as they are metaphorical, have sealed up. Certainly, it feels like maybe that's an aspect of what's going on here, but it's just the idea is that he has more or less had like a full resurrection. I mean, Zangetsu's able to repair itself, right? So why is Ichigo not able to be repaired? But I think it is notable that, Zaraki notices, like, oh shit, he's even not bleeding anymore, after being stabbed kind of almost like supposedly fatally, right? I love this is, finally time for Ichigo to look very composed and Zaraki to look shocked, which is something we really haven't gotten. And here, I love that, like, the cleave through his shoulder comes down to this split in the panel, and we see, like, Zaraki trying to regain his composure, and Ichigo already coming for another slash. And I just love that, like, he's down into this big up chop, which Zaraki goes to block, and is surprised that he's being overpowered. And here, finally, he puts his other hand on his sword to try to, like, hold it back, because he's been fighting one-handed this entire time. So it's neat. Like, this is a notable moment of like, oh, I'm being overpowered and actually having to use both of my hands, right? And I like that he skirts back and he throws his, slices his sword into the wall to catch himself, and here he's been cleaved down one shoulder and up the other, right? And I do love that kind of visual here that we finally see Zaraki like heavily injured. Of course, Ichigo trying to sound cool, like, I don't have much time, I'm gonna finish it quick. I love the inner cut of Zaraki's grin, because he's all about this. This is what he's wanted the entire time. Like, this is what he came here to experience. And I do love, like, in this moment, like, the scar down Zaraki's face almost reads like some sort of crazed lightning bolt. It's wonderful. The momentum and excitement that he has here is palpable. And, like, yeah, he's just, like, literally throwing himself at Ichigo. And this is one that always sticks in my mind, is he, like, flings himself at Ichigo. Ichigo's sword out, and Zaraki just comes towards the point of Zangetsu, and it cleaves, like, straight through, bisects his face, but he doesn't even care. Like, he's willing to take this damage to get in close quarters, to trade blows with Ichigo. I think that's what makes Zaraki such a dangerous opponent, right? Is that he's not afraid of getting cut. Like, he enjoys. There's some sort of sadomasochism there, that, like, the adrenaline of a good fight. Like, he likes getting to actually feel somebody, being able to affect him in that way. And maybe that's the sort of thing, like, that's, whenever you're so strong that nothing can affect you, like, what gives you joy anymore, if that's, like, your thing that you enjoy is fighting, right? Like, how can you find those sensations? And so it's interesting that Zaraki, so much of this character, like, built up that way, like, this kind of far point of, if your sole joy is battle, what does that eventually make you? And it's interesting that ends up being kind of a juxtaposition to Ichigo, because Ichigo doesn't really want to fight, not in the same way Zaraki does, right? Ichigo is here to try to protect people and only fight as he has to, whereas Zaraki doesn't. He fights just for the sake of fighting, right? And I love that Zaraki is, like, elated by this, and he's very curious, like, how did Ichigo even revive himself? How did he get back up? Like, how did he get stronger? All that matters now, though, is that he wants to enjoy this fight. And I love this shot here, especially because it, again, seems almost like it's got, like, that kind of the extreme sort of black silhouette, especially in Zaraki's arm there, renders him, it feels almost skeletal and undead in his design. I love how like, striking it is. And of course, yeah, Ichigo finally just calls him out. And he's like, "Look, how can you be this strong and not enjoy fighting, right? How can you not, revel in death and pain and, the rewards of battle, right? If you're so great at battle." Which is interesting because, like, I mean, Zaraki, come on, you've got 12 other captains that are ostensibly, I mean, arguably the Kenpachi is supposed to be, like, what, the strongest captain, the most capable fighter, but still, there must be, like, among the captaincy, somebody at least, like, on a level that's pretty high up, right? So why is it, I suppose they know better than to get embroiled in a fight with this crazy person. But I do like that we get a break from that, like, that intensity kind of ebbs off as we just get here, Ikaku, and he's just relaxing to kind of pay attention to the battle. He's a little concerned, perhaps, and of course a gag moment where Yumachika's hair is blown up to an afro after getting exploded by Ganju, right? And yeah, like, interestingly enough, like, Ikaku's able to kind of focus on the battle, but Yumachika has to give it a little bit more attention, which is, again, maybe telling. Ikaku being a third seat, Yumachika is fifth. So I like that he has to kind of put his hands up to his ears. But then again, he also is maybe just recovering now. And I like this kind of, like, relaxed sort of back and forth, but you get a little bit of Ikaku's frustration, right? That he's like, well, Zaraki can't lose. And of course he brings up, like, well, he still has, a trump card, right? So Zaraki still has one last thing that he can kind of pull. I like that here we cut back to Zaraki and he's like, really should be dead, right? Like, he's just bleeding all over the place. He expresses that they're evenly matched, or it's close, and then he says that Ichigo is actually stronger than him, right? And so then he tears off this eye patch so that he can fight even more. He can go all out against Ichigo. And I love Ichigo kind of looking like, well, dude, what's going on in this last little moment here before Zaraki tears the eye patch. And I love that we get this full frontal sort of crazed look from him. I love the cross slash across his face, the slices on his chest, like all of that helps really sell that moment. And then we get to the end of the chapter, and yet more of the journal that has these constant scratched out moments. I do think that's really great. But yeah, it's exciting stuff. I think the choreography is pretty top notch. I like the kind of back and forth that we really get between Ichigo and Zaraki here. I think I certainly buy it. There's like a visceral quality, especially to like these wounds that Zaraki's finally kind of taking left and right. Whatever earlier, like he was like basically a stone wall for Ichigo. So that certainly felt. This is a battle I think the anime does pretty well. I do recommend going and finding and checking out those episodes if you have not watched them. Uh, yeah, handles it fairly well from what I remember. Um, but yeah, all things considered, really do like kind of just how tight and focused this is. Like, I like that, like, it is not a complete stomp by Ichigo, that Ichigo gets back up and he's able to actually, land all these wounds. But even though Ichigo's still, like, the one that is, fighting, like, putting up a fighting effort, Zaraki's still the one that's in charge of the momentum of the page here. He's still the one moving kind of right to left, and, like, forcing Ichigo back even, which is interesting. So yeah, it's neat. Like, again, just like thinking about like that layout, that Zaraki being this sort of immovable tyrant that's constantly pushing our protagonist back, and then Ichigo finally surging forward to fight that back, and then realizing that doesn't even matter. That Zaraki's willing to basically like plunge himself onto Ichigo's sword to get a hit in is certainly telling. There's a little bit of spoiler stuff that I would like to talk about for this chapter, so I will get to that. I won't overburden you with analysis, but if there is something that you noticed about this chapter that you'd like to talk about, or if you'd like to just discuss anything we brought up, feel free to talk about it in the comments. I'm always down to engage there. Thank you very much. But let's talk about spoilers. Let's talk about how this connects to the rest of the Bleach as a whole. And I think, most immediately is that we have this moment between, Zangetsu and Zangetsu, really. But I mentioned the Yasauchi and that, like, the idea that he's able to form one because essentially he is the hollow spirit, right? That would be essentially serving as Nasuichi for Ichigo, which is interesting that, like, of course he reflects Ichigo because he is imprinted with Ichigo as he is at 15. It's kind of cute. Like, I always thought, like, okay, well, why does White look exactly like Ichigo except like inverted? And then whenever I really thought about it, like, it's like, well, Ichigo didn't start really imprinting himself onto the hollow that is Zangetsu, like the Asauchi, right? He didn't really start imprinting himself until like just now, so it's a reflection of who he is like just now, right? Which is kind of cute. Um, whereas Zangetsu is basically representative of this Quincy power that Ichigo has probably been, essentially been carrying with him since birth. And I mean, really, White you could argue is like that residual hollow power, right? That hollow power that has been dormant. Ichigo as a full bring. Ichigo has carrying White's power from, the attack on his mother and all of that. But yeah, certainly like that's present in there. But the reason why White looks this way, I feel, is because of Ichigo's recent status of imprinting, into Zangetsu, and ultimately, like Tensa Zangetsu, the fused version of the two, maybe better represents the actual synthesis of his power. Uh, anyway, um, of course, I do like that ultimately there's this kind of black-white element, right? That there's this duality within Ichigo. The whole yin and yang thing, surely, but there's these two forces that are both different sentiences, and the whole like he's strong, his power will be mine. As we know, White is kind of seeking to control Ichigo to even take over because he is this kind of rampant hollow id consciousness, perhaps. So he represents that sort of that aspect of Ichigo too, that Ichigo has to rein in, because it is as much as it is representative of his Shinigami powers, is also this hollow facet of him. So I think that's neat that the again those two consciousnesses at play that make up Zangetsu, which is ultimately why Zangetsu is two swords, right? Because you could try to force them together, but they ultimately don't gel. They are black and white. They are two separate kind of forces. That synthesis is what makes Ichigo who he is, but represented as a blade, he doesn't really hit there until he hits there, right? Which is neat. Of course, all of the rain, that whole being a thing. I mean, we kind of covered that in our analysis. But yeah, I love, believe me, you aren't fighting alone. Like, clearly, he's got two different, not even speaking about all of his allies, having the two different spirits essentially with him of both actual Zangetsu and Old Man Zangetsu. Basically, his Yawok's power personified. Which I do, again, I really do like that, he is the black of Yawok and the Almighty. See Yawok, Yahweh, whatnot, whatever. It just happens to be coincidentally that black is the predominant color of the Shinigami, which is interesting. I think it's a cool kind of color thing. But again, Yuhabak, he's, I'm gonna pronounce his name differently every time. Being the Almighty, like he is everything, right? He is essentially meant to be like this god force. The only thing that doesn't really incorporate is Hollow Ryatsu, I suppose. I mean, technically, I guess he's not a Shinigami either, but just Quincy. Nevertheless, I think it's cool. As far as, I think the only other big thing here, the bleeding stopping, and the kind of resurrection, the getting back up, I think it's notable that is all Quincy stuff, right? That's essentially, that is Zangetsu that is stopping his bleeding. And whenever I say Zangetsu, I mean Old Man Zangetsu, that is like Quincy technique. As is, like, because I talked about that too, like the idea of like making the Reishi platforms for him to stand on, I believe is also basically a Quincy thing too. The way that he's able to kind of stand in the sky way earlier. I'm pretty sure that those are all essentially Quincy moves, but I could be wrong. Certainly the bleeding stopping and Zaraki being like, what the hell? That's meant to kind of be like a little nod, like, hey, that's not normal. And I think the bleeding stopping on its own is not just not normal, like in a hey, haha, later on we get Blue Fine and Thousand Year Blood War retroactively makes this significant, whereas here maybe it was just a thing that happened. But I think that there is a lot of evidence for that happening here, not just Zaraki's surprise here, but also the fact that I think in the next chapter, like Old Man Zangetsu specifically says that he's like holding back his bleeding or doing whatever he can. More than that, though, we're coming off of the fight with Ikaku, where Ikaku had a specific tool of like an aspect of his Zanpakuto that was made to staunch his own bleeding, right? So, like, the fact that you can just stop bleeding is something that Shinigami can't, or they're not supposed to do, right? It's not normal, and I think that's meant to be kind of like a thing that you might pick up on, but here we can just read it as like, oh well, Ichigo's getting the second win because he's finally fighting with Zangetsu, but I always I don't say I always read it. I now read it very much as like him tapping into these Quincy powers. And Zaraki perhaps recognizing that to a degree, right? Um, as far as everything else goes, I don't think there's really anything else that I wanted to talk about. I mean, yeah, the whole like how you revived suddenly got stronger, all of that. Um, yeah, like that being something that Zaraki's not used to seeing, even though he is certainly used to seeing people release their Shikai or even their Bankai. So the fact that Zaraki is like elated by this and not wasn't expecting it speaks towards it being outside the realm of Shinigami. Um, yeah, yeah. It's kind of interesting also that like he considers like death and pain the rewards of battle. And like so much of like his ethos on battle here is interesting to see, especially like seeing how openly he becomes wounded whenever engaged in battle, and thinking about that in relationship to ultimately where Unohana Retsu, where she ends up, where she's like, okay, well, I'm going to be able to heal to kind of prevent that and continue to be able to fight, but like, I don't know. I don't know. It's so much that she revels in the death and the pain. It's weird. Like she certainly seems more like involved in the technique and being able to prolong your capability to stay in a fight, rather than I don't know, like Zaraki who lowers himself to it. It's weird. It's curious. Um, yeah. As far as like Ichigo kind of being a different person from whenever he fought Ikaku, I think that's just merely reflective in the fact that he is actually wielding Zangetsu, um, and tapping into it a little bit more. The other big thing here is like, again, and this is more maybe book related. Some can't figure your own world, perhaps. Um, or was it Spirits Are Forever with You? I think it's Spirits Are Forever with You, actually. But one of the Naruto novels, the whole idea is that Kenpachi's ability is to scale to his opponent, right? And perhaps he's scaled to Ichigo here to a certain degree. But I think I certainly can read it that way, that he's sort of like his powers finally evened out with Ichigo's, or at least has bottomed out to the point to where he can fight Ichigo as an equal after Ichigo's gotten this boost. I don't know. People often again give this fight a lot of flack because it's like, well, how did Ichigo get to such strength? And it's like, well, there's everything that we've talked about before about resolve, about actually using one Zenpakuto, about all of that. But I think to a degree, there's also this aspect of Kenpachi sort of lowering himself, even if he's not conscious of it. We certainly get that one shot of Yachiru she's there and paying attention to the fight, and kind of not remarking on it and kind of seeming very focused. So perhaps that's meant to represent that. I don't know. I definitely feel as though like Kenpachi is kind of trying to sort of find a barometer for where Ichigo's at, and that's why he's excited to kind of take his eye patch off and like not have to use the the various restraints that he has, I suppose. Even though his very sword and like everything about his fighting technique is a restraint too. You know, it's interesting. Like Kenpachi has to start like really reconsidering his restraints, and I think ultimately, later on in the series we see where his sword isn't weakening him down to where opponents are, but raising him up, right? Where he can like literally cut like things that are conceptual, where he gets in that Gurney fight, and ultimately where he gets with his Bankai in that fight with Gerard, where it's too much power for his physical, or I say physical, for his Kanpaku to handle, that he's essentially scaling to such like ridiculous limits. But yeah, Kanpaku's all just like a scaling character, which is, I think, kind of interesting. I don't know if I 100% agree with like that reading. Like, to me, it feels kind of cheap because, like, oh yeah, well, he can fight a new enemy and be like just like on a match. And he uses these different tools to kind of elevate him higher or lower. But it makes sense and certainly like helps to explain kind of where he is for all these battles. But I think there's always an alternate explanation that makes plenty of sense too, and certainly an explanation that I've posted as far as Ichigo actually tapping into his powers and Zaraki, up to this point, sort of underestimating him, is valid. Now, I am recording this just a little bit after the fact, because I was going back and re-listening to the audio as I was editing the episode, and one kind of maybe arguably some like fourth level nonsense that I will talk about here that I think is kind of cute to think about, is here. This is interesting. This is 100% some Thousand Year Blood War stuff, but this mention of Ichigo being the king of the world is in Ichigo being the potential Soul King, right? And this recognition that they need him to win not just this battle internally inside of his soul, but they need Ichigo to win in the final battle against Yuha Bak. And that ultimately White recognizes, well, I'm going to help out whatever way that I can. And he says that I'll go home, right? And then he merges with Zangetsu. And so ultimately Ichigo needs to reconcile the fact that this is all his power and that he has to wield it appropriately in order to be able to kind of, win and be the king of the world, be the Soul King. I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that one. If you think I'm completely like out of my mind, I certainly feel like whatever this is being written, maybe this isn't meant to be interpreted in that way. But certainly on a reread, I can read it in that light, right? That Ichigo is meant to essentially win this larger battle. And certainly Old Man Zangetsu would be aware of the fact that Ichigo would eventually need to defeat the Almighty, because again, all timelines before, I don't think Zangetsu has Almighty power, but I think Zangetsu being derivative of Yuha Bak and Yuha Bak having access to the Almighty, on some level Zangetsu knows that, and when I say Zangetsu, I mean Old Man Zangetsu. On some level, Old Man Zangetsu knows that Ichigo will have to fight Yuha Bak at some point. The fate of the world is dependent on it. At the very least, I tend to interpret it that way. I tend to think that there's some aspect of him that understands that. And that this whole idea of like, well, we need him to win, makes sense. It's interesting. It's cute to think about. I don't know if it's meant to be interpreted certainly that way, but it is a cute little idea, nevertheless. What are your thoughts on that one? What do you think about that one? Tag that one for spoilers. That's it for this one, folks. Basically, if you got to the end of this video, congratulations. Please give the video a like if you haven't already. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, I do recommend giving the channel a subscribe. I try to put up these videos every weekday. Whenever I don't, I will try to make a post on Twitter. I'm not always capable of that, so please do bear with me. I am just one dude running this whole show. But otherwise, the other way that you can support me is through Patreon. There is a link in every video description, this one included. And yeah, if you support me on Patreon, your name can be in the credits right here, along with the other beautiful, beautiful, wonderful subscribers. Thank you very much, those of you who support me on Patreon. I really do appreciate that. But yeah, that's it for this one, folks. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I have been Karkur Gold. I'm reminding you that spirits are forever with you. Stay gold.